Thomas Whitfield had always dreamed of wearing the red tunic and bearskin hat of the Queen's Guard. Growing up in a small village outside London, he would watch the changing of the Guard ceremony on television, mesmerized by the precision and honor of these elite soldiers. His grandfather had served in the Royal Navy during World War II, and stories of duty and service filled Thomas's childhood evenings by the fireplace. At 18, Thomas enlisted in the British Army with one clear goal: to join the Household Division and eventually serve at Windsor Castle. The training was brutal, but his determination never wavered. 5 years later, after proving himself in various postings, he received the letter that would change his life forever. He was being transferred to the Coldstream Guards, one of the oldest regiments in the British Army, with immediate assignment to Windsor Castle. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle seemed to whisper centuries of secrets as secrets. Thomas first walked through its gates in September 2019. The castle had witnessed coronations, royal weddings, state visits, and countless moments of British history. For Thomas, stepping onto these grounds felt like entering a sacred space where tradition and duty converged. His first week was overwhelming. The castle operated like a small city, with hundreds of staff members working tirelessly to maintain its grandeur and security. There were gardeners who had tended the same flower beds for decades, housekeepers who knew every hidden passage, and guards who had protected the royal family through multiple generations. Thomas felt the weight of this legacy on his shoulders. As he learned his duties, the guardroom became his second home, a place where conversations flowed between shifts about everything from family back home to the peculiarities of royal protocol. His fellow guards were a mix of seasoned veterans and newcomers like himself. Among them was James Crawford, a man in his early 30s who had been at Windsor for nearly 8 years. James had an easy smile and seemed to know everyone. From the kitchen staff to the senior officers, James took Thomas under his wing during those first crucial weeks. He showed him the shortcuts through the castle's maze-like corridors, taught him the unwritten rules that governed daily life among the staff, and shared stories that helped Thomas understand the delicate balance between protecting the royal family and respecting their privacy. The two men quickly developed a friendship built on shared duties and mutual respect. What struck Thomas most about Windsor was how it felt like two different worlds existing side by side. There was the public face of the castle, where tourists gathered daily to watch the changing of the guard and admire the state apartments. Then there was the private world of the royal family, a realm of quiet dignity and routine that the guards protected with their lives. Thomas's duties varied from day to day. Sometimes he stood at attention for hours, watching over the castle grounds with eyes trained to spot any unusual activity. Other times he accompanied royal family members on walks through the private gardens, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring their safety. He learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when the Queen was in residence, how the atmosphere of the entire castle seemed to shift with her presence. The Queen herself was a figure of quiet authority who commanded respect simply by walking into a room. Thomas's first encounter with her came during his 3rd week, when she passed by his post during her morning walk with her beloved corgis. She nodded slightly in his direction, a small gesture that filled him with pride. For days afterward, he understood why his fellow guards spoke of her with such reverence. As autumn turned to winter, Thomas settled into the rhythm of castle life. The changing seasons brought different challenges and responsibilities. Winter meant fewer tourists, but more security concerns, especially during the holiday season when the royal family gathered for Christmas celebrations. Thomas learned to navigate the increased activity while maintaining the same level of vigilance and professionalism. His relationship with James deepened during the long winter nights, when they often found themselves on the same shifts. James shared stories of his childhood in Scotland, his decision to join the army, and his hopes for the future. Thomas reciprocated with tales of his village upbringing and his grandfather's war stories. Their conversations helped pass the quiet hours when the castle settled into its nighttime stillness. It was during one of these conversations in late January that James first mentioned his financial troubles. His mother was ill back in Scotland, requiring expensive medical care that wasn't fully covered by the National Health Service. His younger sister was attending university and James was helping with her tuition fees, salary of a guardsman. While respectable, wasn't enough to cover these unexpected expenses. Thomas listened sympathetically, offering what support he could. He suggested James speak with their commanding officer about emergency leave or financial assistance programs available to military personnel. James seemed grateful for the advice, but appeared reluctant to ask for help through official channels. He worried that drawing attention to his personal problems might affect his career prospects or his standing within the regiment as winter gave way to spring. Thomas noticed subtle changes in James's behavior. His friend seemed more nervous, less likely to engage in their usual conversations. James began volunteering for extra duties, particularly those involving areas of the castle that were typically off-limits to junior guards. When Thomas asked about this increased activity, James explained that he was trying to prove himself worthy of promotion. The explanation made sense on the surface, but something nagged at Thomas. James's nervous energy seemed disproportionate to normal career ambitions. There were moments when Thomas caught James looking around anxiously, as if checking to see who might be watching. These incidents were subtle, easy to dismiss as stress from family pressures, but they accumulated in Thomas's mind like small, lead puzzle pieces waiting to form a complete picture. Spring brought increased activity to Windsor Castle as the tourist season began in earnest. The gardens bloomed with carefully tended flowers, and the ceremonial duties became more frequent with visiting dignitaries and state occasions. Thomas found himself assigned to more prestigious duties, a sign that his superiors were pleased with his performance and dedication. Yet even as his own career flourished, his concerns about James continued to grow. The changes in his friend's behavior were becoming more pronounced. And Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening beneath the surface of their daily routines at Windsor Castle. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came on a rainy Thursday morning in April. Thomas was conducting his routine patrol of the castle grounds when he noticed James emerging from a section of the castle that housed administrative offices. This wasn't unusual in itself, but James looked startled when he saw Thomas quickly shoving something into his jacket pocket. "Morning rounds?" Thomas called out, trying to keep his tone casual. James forced a smile and nodded, but his eyes darted away from Thomas's gaze. The brief encounter left Thomas feeling uneasy, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. There had been something almost guilty in James's expression, a look Thomas had never seen before on his friend's face. Over the next few weeks, Thomas began to notice a pattern. James would disappear during certain shifts, always with reasonable explanations about additional duties or meetings with supervisors. But these absences seemed to coincide with specific events or activities at the castle. Thomas started keeping mental notes, not out of suspicion initially, but because the irregularity bothered him. The castle's security protocols were incredibly detailed and strict. Every movement of personnel was logged, every access to restricted areas was monitored, and every interaction with royal family members was documented. These measures existed not just to protect the royal family, but to protect the staff as well. Any deviation from standard procedures could raise questions about loyalty and trustworthiness. Thomas's unease deepened when he overheard a conversation between two senior officers discussing some missing documents from the royal household's administrative offices. The documents weren't classified state secrets, but they contained detailed information about the royal family's private schedules, security arrangements for upcoming events, and personal preferences that could be valuable to tabloid journalists or anyone seeking to exploit inside knowledge. The investigation into the missing documents was being conducted quietly to avoid causing panic among the staff or alerting potential culprits. Thomas learned about it only because he happened to be nearby when the officers thought they were speaking privately. The casual mention of internal security concerns sent a chill down his spine as he remembered James's nervous behavior and unexplained appearances in administrative areas. That evening, Thomas found himself torn between loyalty to his friend and duty to his position. James had been kind to him from his first day at Windsor, offering guidance and friendship when Thomas needed it most. The idea that James might be involved in something inappropriate seemed impossible, yet the evidence was beginning to accumulate, and Thomas couldn't ignore the growing pattern of suspicious behavior. During their next shared duty, Thomas decided to approach James directly, but carefully. They were stationed in the castle's long walk, watching for any unusual activity among the tourists and visitors. The spring weather had brought larger crowds than usual, providing cover for their conversation. "You seem stressed lately," Thomas observed, keeping his voice low and friendly. "Everything all right at home? How's your mother doing?" James's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed, and he looked away quickly before responding with obvious reluctance. "She's getting better. The treatments are helping, but they're expensive. Really expensive." James's voice carried a strain that Thomas hadn't heard before. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, you know? The army pays well, but not well enough for everything I need to cover." The conversation revealed more than James probably intended. His financial pressures had apparently worsened, and the stress was clearly affecting him. Thomas felt a surge of sympathy for his friend's situation, but also a growing concern about how James might be addressing these pressures. Over the following days, Thomas began to observe James more carefully without making it obvious. He noticed that James had developed relationships with people outside their usual circle of fellow guards and castle staff. There were brief conversations with individuals Thomas didn't recognize, meetings that seemed to happen during breaks or between shifts. One particularly disturbing incident occurred during a state dinner preparation. Thomas was assigned to security detail while James was supposedly helping with protocol arrangements. Thomas spotted James in conversation with a man in an expensive suit, who didn't appear to be part of the official guest list or catering staff. The conversation looked intense, and Thomas saw James nod several times before the stranger handed him something small enough to be concealed in a palm. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it confirmed Thomas's worst fears. James was clearly involved in something beyond his normal duties, something that required secrecy and involved people who didn't belong at Windsor Castle. Thomas felt sick to his stomach as he realized his friend might be betraying everything they had sworn to protect. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in his barracks bed, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with impossible choices. If he reported his suspicions about James, he would be destroying the career and reputation of someone who had been nothing but kind to him. But if James was indeed involved in selling information about the royal family, Thomas's silence would make him complicit in that betrayal. The weight of tradition and history at Windsor Castle suddenly felt crushing rather than inspiring. Every portrait on the walls, every ceremonial sword and uniform, every symbol of duty and honor seemed to reproach Thomas for his indecision. The oath he had taken when joining the guards was clear. His loyalty belonged to the crown above all. Personal considerations. The next morning brought news that made Thomas's decision urgent. Another batch of documents had gone missing, this time including detailed floor plans of the castle's private quarters and information about the Queen's daily routines. The security investigation was being expanded, and all personnel would soon be subject to enhanced scrutiny and questioning. Thomas realized he was running out of time. If James was responsible for the missing documents, it would only be a matter of time before the investigation uncovered evidence pointing to him. When that happened, anyone who had observed suspicious behavior and failed to report it would also be under suspicion. Thomas's own career and reputation would be at risk if he continued to remain silent. The internal conflict was tearing Thomas apart. James represented everything Thomas had hoped to find at Windsor: mentorship, friendship, and a connection to the proud traditions of the guards. But those same traditions demanded absolute loyalty to duty over personal relationships. The code of honor that had drawn Thomas to this life was now forcing him to choose between protecting a friend and protecting the institution they both served. As Thomas prepared for another day of duties, he made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue to ignore what he had witnessed, regardless of the personal cost. The safety and privacy of the royal family had to come first, even if it meant betraying someone he cared about. Thomas spent the morning of his decision in a state of nervous anticipation. He had requested a private meeting with Major Harrison, the commanding officer responsible for internal security matters at Windsor Castle. The major was known for his fairness, but also his unwavering commitment to protecting the royal family and maintaining the integrity of the guards. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, giving Thomas several hours to reconsider his decision. During his morning duties, he found himself studying James's face, looking for any sign that might contradict his suspicions. But James seemed more anxious than ever, constantly checking his watch and appearing distracted during conversations with other guards. At lunch, James approached Thomas with an unusual request. He needed someone to cover part of his afternoon shift because he had been called to help with inventory in the castle's archive rooms. The explanation felt rehearsed, and Thomas noticed that James avoided eye contact while speaking. Likely another opportunity for James to access sensitive areas of the castle without proper supervision. Thomas agreed to cover the shift, but the request only strengthened his resolve. James was clearly planning something for that afternoon, and Thomas couldn't allow it to proceed unchallenged. The weight of his decision pressed down on him as he walked through the castle corridors toward Major Harrison's office. Major Harrison's office was located in one of the castle's older sections, where thick stone walls muffled sound and created an atmosphere of serious confidentiality. The major was a career military officer who had served in various capacities before being assigned to Windsor. His reputation for discretion and thorough investigation made him the ideal person to handle sensitive security matters. Thomas knocked on the heavy wooden door at precisely 2 o'clock. Major Harrison's voice called for him to enter, and Thomas stepped into a room that reflected both military efficiency and respect for the castle's historic character. Maps of the castle grounds covered one wall. Another displayed photographs of the current royal family in various ceremonial occasions. Guardsman Whitfield, Major Harrison greeted him, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I understand. You have something important to discuss. This conversation will be treated with complete confidentiality unless circumstances require otherwise. Thomas took a deep breath and began to explain his observations about James's behavior over the past several weeks. He detailed the unexplained appearances in administrative areas, the nervous behavior, the conversation with the unidentified stranger, and the pattern of absences that seemed to coincide with security incidents. Major Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. His expression remained neutral, but Thomas could see the concern growing in his eyes as the story unfolded. When Thomas finished speaking, the office fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. These are serious allegations, Guardsman Whitfield, Major Harrison finally said. Sergeant Crawford has been with us for 8 years and has an exemplary record. However, the incidents you've described do coincide with our ongoing investigation into missing documents and potential security breaches. The major explained that the investigation had already identified several potential suspects based on access logs and duty schedules. James's name had appeared on the list, but without concrete evidence or witness testimony, they couldn't take action. Thomas's observations provided the missing piece that could justify a more thorough investigation. I want you to understand the gravity of what you're telling me, Major Harrison continued. If Sergeant Crawford is indeed involved in unauthorized activities, it represents a serious breach of trust that could have implications for national security. The royal family's safety and privacy depend on our ability to maintain absolute discretion and loyalty. Thomas felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. He had known intellectually that his suspicions about James represented a serious matter, but hearing it articulated by Major Harrison made the reality more concrete. This wasn't just about a friend making poor choices. It was about potential threats to the people they had sworn to protect. Major Harrison outlined the next steps in the investigation. Thomas would continue his normal duties, but would also serve as an unofficial observer, documenting any further suspicious behavior. A team of security specialists would begin monitoring James's movements more closely, and they would investigate his recent financial transactions and communications. I need you to act normally around Sergeant Crawford, Major Harrison instructed. Any change in your behavior might alert him to our investigation and give him an opportunity to destroy evidence or cease his activities before we can gather sufficient proof. This instruction presented Thomas with perhaps the most difficult aspect of his decision, he would have to continue his friendship with James while knowing that everything James said or did was being evaluated for signs of betrayal. The duplicity felt wrong, but Thomas understood its necessity for the larger goal of protecting the royal family. That evening, Thomas found himself on duty with James for the first time since his meeting with Major Harrison. James seemed even more nervous than usual, constantly checking his surroundings and appearing jumpy at unexpected sounds. Thomas tried to maintain normal conversation, but the knowledge of the ongoing investigation made every interaction feel strained and artificial. James brought up his mother's health again, mentioning that the medical bills were becoming overwhelming, despite his best efforts to manage them. He spoke about feeling desperate to find additional sources of income, and Thomas felt a pang of sympathy despite everything. James's financial pressures were real and understandable, even if his response to them was inexcusable. "I sometimes wonder if there are opportunities we're not seeing," James said quietly, looking out over the castle grounds. "Ways to use our position here to help our families without really hurting anyone." The comment felt like a confession, and Thomas realized that James might be seeking absolution or understanding for choices he had already made. Thomas chose his words carefully, trying to sound supportive while not encouraging James's apparent rationalization of his behavior. "The position we have here is already a privilege," he said. "Sometimes the best way to help our families is to maintain that privilege by doing our jobs with integrity." James nodded but didn't seem convinced. Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out on his friend's face. The conflict between knowing what was right and feeling pressured by circumstances beyond his control. For a moment, Thomas wondered if there might have been a way to help James address his financial problems without compromising his integrity. But it was probably too late for such alternatives. The shift passed slowly, with both men lost in their own thoughts. Thomas found himself studying the castle around them, thinking about all the history these walls had witnessed. How many other guards had faced similar moral dilemmas over the centuries? How many had chosen duty over friendship, or friendship over duty? The weight of tradition felt both inspiring and burdensome. As they prepared to end their shift, James made one final comment that would haunt Thomas for days afterward. "You're a good friend, Thomas," he said with obvious emotion. "I hope you know that whatever happens, I never meant to let anyone down." The statement felt like a goodbye, and Thomas worried that James might be planning something drastic as the investigation closed in around him. The investigation into James's activities moved swiftly once Major Harrison had sufficient evidence to proceed. Within 3 days of Thomas's report, a team of security specialists had compiled a comprehensive picture of James's recent behavior, financial transactions, and communications. What they discovered exceeded even Thomas's worst suspicions about his friend's betrayal. James had been systematically photographing and copying sensitive documents related to the royal family's private schedules, security arrangements, and personal preferences. The information was being sold to a contact who represented a network of tabloid journalists and celebrity photographers seeking insider access to royal activities. The money James received wasn't enormous by most standards, but it was enough to help cover his mother's medical expenses and his sister's university fees. Major Harrison called Thomas to another private meeting to share the findings and prepare him for what was about to happen. Evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. James's phone records showed regular contact with known tabloid sources. His bank account reflected deposits that corresponded with the timing of missing documents, and surveillance footage had captured him photographing files in restricted areas. "We'll be making the arrest tomorrow morning," Major Harrison informed Thomas. "I want you to be prepared for the impact this will have on the entire regiment. When one of our own betrays the trust placed in us, it affects everyone's reputation and morale." Thomas felt sick thinking about James being led away in handcuffs, but he also understood the necessity of it. The betrayal went beyond mere document theft. It represented a fundamental violation of the oath every guard took to protect the royal family's privacy and security. James's financial pressures might explain his actions, but they couldn't excuse them. The arrest took place during the morning shift change, when most of the guards were gathered for briefings and assignments. James was called to Major Harrison's office under the pretense of a routine meeting, but he never returned to the guard room. Word spread quickly through the castle that something significant had happened, though the specific details were initially kept confidential. Thomas watched from his assigned post as security personnel escorted James from the castle in civilian clothes rather than his uniform. James looked defeated and ashamed, his shoulders slumped as he walked between two officers toward a waiting vehicle. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the castle courtyard, and Thomas saw recognition and perhaps gratitude in James's expression. Even in his disgrace, James seemed to understand that Thomas had tried to minimize the damage by reporting his concerns early, rather than allowing the situation to escalate further. The official announcement to the guards came that afternoon. Major Harrison gathered all personnel in the castle's Great Hall, a space normally reserved for ceremonial occasions. The gravity of the situation was emphasized by the formal setting and the presence of senior officers from the Household Division. Headquarters in London. It is with great regret that I must inform you of a serious breach of trust within our ranks, Major Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient hall. Sergeant James Crawford has been arrested on charges related to the unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information about the royal family and castle security procedures. The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled guards, and many had served alongside James for years, considering him a trusted colleague and friend. The revelation that he had been systematically betraying their shared mission was devastating to morale and raised uncomfortable questions about how well they really knew each other. Thomas found himself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations following the announcement. While his role in the investigation wasn't publicly revealed, some of his colleagues seemed to sense that he had been involved in exposing James's activities. The attention made him uncomfortable, particularly since he was still struggling with guilt about his friend's downfall. The days following James's arrest were difficult for everyone at Windsor Castle. Security procedures were reviewed and tightened, with new protocols implemented to prevent similar breaches in the future. Every guard underwent additional background checks and interviews, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and scrutiny that was foreign to the usually close-knit community. Thomas found himself called in for multiple interviews with security investigators who wanted to understand the timeline of his observations and the nature of his relationship with James. These sessions were thorough but professional, and Thomas gradually came to understand the full scope of what James had done and the potential consequences for royal security. The information James had sold included detailed maps of the castle's private quarters, schedules of the Queen's daily walks with her dogs, security protocols for visiting dignitaries, and personal information about the royal family's preferences and habits. This intelligence could have been used to compromise the safety of the royal family or to facilitate unauthorized photography and surveillance. Most disturbing was the discovery that James's contact had been planning to use the information to orchestrate a major breach of royal privacy during an upcoming state visit. The plot involved positioning photographers in locations where they could capture intimate moments of the royal family, using James's inside knowledge to predict their movements and vulnerabilities. The broader implications of James's betrayal extended beyond Windsor Castle to the entire Household Division. Questions were raised about recruitment practices, security clearances, and the support systems available to guards facing personal difficulties. The incident prompted a comprehensive review of procedures designed to prevent future breaches while maintaining the trust and camaraderie essential to effective service. Thomas struggled with conflicting emotions as details of James's activities became clearer. His anger at the betrayal was mixed with sadness for his friend's destroyed career and sympathy for the family's circumstances that had driven James to such desperate measures. The situation highlighted the human cost of the enormous responsibility placed on those who serve the royal family. The media attention surrounding James's arrest was intense but carefully managed. The palace's press office worked to minimize details that could compromise ongoing security measures while acknowledging the seriousness of the breach. Headlines spoke of a traitor in the ranks and questioned the reliability of royal protection. Adding external pressure to the internal turmoil within the guards, Thomas found some comfort in conversations with older guards who had witnessed similar incidents during their careers. It reminded him that institutions like the household division survived not by avoiding all problems, but by addressing them decisively when they arose. His decision to report James's suspicious behavior, though painful, had prevented a much more serious breach of royal security. The investigation also revealed that James's activities had been noticed by other guards, but they had chosen to remain silent out of loyalty or uncertainty. Thomas's willingness to come forward, despite the personal cost, was recognized by his superiors as exemplifying the highest standards of duty and integrity. As the immediate crisis subsided, Thomas began to understand that his role in exposing James's betrayal, while difficult, had been necessary for the safety and security of the people they all served. The guilt he felt about destroying James's career was gradually replaced by a deeper appreciation for the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the uniform of the Queen's Guard. The trial of James Crawford began 3 months after his arrest, held at the Old Bailey under heightened security measures. Thomas received a summons to testify as a key witness for the prosecution, a prospect that filled him with dread. He would have to stand in open court and describe his observations of James's suspicious behavior, effectively sealing his former friend's fate. The weeks leading up to the trial were challenging for Thomas and the entire Windsor Castle guard detail. Media attention remained intense, with reporters constantly seeking interviews and inside information about the case. The castle's press office worked overtime to manage the coverage while protecting the privacy of the royal family and the integrity of the ongoing legal proceedings. Thomas spent considerable time preparing for his testimony with prosecutors who needed to understand exactly what he had observed and when. The lawyers were thorough but patient, helping him organize his recollections into a coherent timeline that would be comprehensible to a jury. The preparation process forced Thomas to relive those difficult weeks when he had slowly realized his friend was betraying everything they both claimed to value. On the day of his testimony, Thomas wore his dress uniform at the request of the prosecution, who wanted the jury to understand the gravity of the betrayal within the context of military service and duty to the crown. Walking into the courtroom, Thomas saw James for the first time since his arrest. His former friend looked older and more fragile, wearing a simple civilian suit that emphasized how far he had fallen from his position of honor and responsibility. Their eyes met briefly as Thomas took the witness stand, and James's expression showed a mixture of regret and resignation. Thomas felt a surge of sadness for everything that had been lost. Not just James's career and freedom, but their friendship and the trust that had once existed between them. Thomas's testimony lasted most of the morning, described as growing concerns about James's behavior, the suspicious meetings, the unexplained appearances in restricted areas, and the overall pattern of activity that had ultimately led to his decision to report his observations to Major Harrison. The prosecutors guided him through each incident methodically, building a comprehensive picture of James's descent into betrayal. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on Thomas's motives for reporting James and questioned whether friendship should have taken precedence over duty. The lawyer suggested that Thomas might have been jealous of James's longer service record or seeking advancement through the elimination of a rival. These accusations stung, but Thomas answered them honestly, explaining that his decision had been driven by concern for the royal family's safety rather than personal ambition. James's defense strategy centered on his desperate financial circumstances and the lack of support available to guards facing family crises. His lawyer painted a picture of a dedicated soldier driven to desperate measures by his mother's illness and his sister's educational needs. Character witnesses testified about James's previous exemplary service and his genuine devotion to the royal family. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the systematic nature of James's betrayal and the potential consequences of his actions. Expert witnesses explained how the information he had sold could have been used to compromise royal security, and representatives from the palace testified about the impact of the breach on their ability to protect the royal family effectively. The trial revealed details about James's activities that shocked even Thomas, who thought he understood the scope of his friend's betrayal. James had been selling information for nearly 6 months before Thomas first noticed his suspicious behavior. The intelligence he provided had already been used to facilitate several unauthorized photographs of the royal family in supposedly private moments. Most disturbing was evidence that James's contact had been planning to use the information to orchestrate a major security incident during the Queen's upcoming visit to Scotland. The plot involved coordinating multiple photographers and possibly protesters to create chaos that could have endangered the Queen's safety while providing dramatic footage for international media consumption. Thomas realized that his decision to report James, as painful as it had been, had likely prevented a serious threat to the Queen's safety. This knowledge provided some comfort as he listened to the detailed testimony about James's betrayal. But it didn't eliminate his sadness. About the destruction of their friendship, the jury deliberated for 2 days, before returning with a verdict of guilty on all charges. James showed little reaction as the verdict was read, but Thomas saw his shoulders slump slightly as the reality of his situation became final. The sentencing phase would determine how many years James would spend in prison for his betrayal of the crown and his oath as a guardsman during the sentencing hearing. James was finally given an opportunity to speak on his own behalf. He stood slowly and faced the judge with obvious difficulty, struggling to find words that could express his remorse while explaining his actions. "Your Honor," James began, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom, "I want to apologize. To Her Majesty, to my fellow guards, and to everyone whose trust I betrayed. My mother's illness and my family's financial problems never justified what I did. I violated everything I swore to protect, and I have no excuse for that betrayal." James went on to describe the gradual process by which financial pressure had led him to rationalize increasingly serious compromises. He explained how the first small payment for relatively harmless information had led to demands for more sensitive intelligence, creating a spiral of betrayal that became increasingly difficult to escape. "I know that Guardsman Whitfield did what he had to do in reporting my activities," James continued, glancing briefly at Thomas in the gallery. "His loyalty to duty over friendship exemplifies the values I should have maintained. Him for my downfall. I blame myself for putting him in that impossible position." The judge listened carefully to James's statement before delivering a sentence of 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years contingent on good behavior and cooperation with ongoing security reviews. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crime and some consideration for James's previously exemplary record and genuine remorse. As court officials led James away to begin serving his sentence, he looked one final time toward Thomas. In that glance, Thomas saw acceptance and perhaps even gratitude that their friendship had ultimately served the cause of duty and protection that brought them together at Windsor Castle. Walking out of the courthouse, Thomas felt emotionally drained, but also somehow cleansed. The legal proceedings had provided closure to a chapter that had been enormously difficult for everyone involved. The trial had also served as a public reminder of the standards expected of those who serve the crown and the consequences of betraying that trust. The drive back to Windsor Castle took Thomas through the English countryside he had come to love during his service. The familiar landmarks and rolling hills provided a sense of continuity and purpose that helped him process everything that had happened. Despite the pain of recent events, he remained committed to his role as a guardian of the royal family and the traditions they represented. 6 months after James Crawford's sentencing, life at Windsor Castle had returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the scars of his betrayal remained visible in the enhanced security protocols and the cautious atmosphere among the guards. Thomas had been promoted to corporal, a recognition of his integrity during the crisis and his exemplary service in the months that followed. The promotion ceremony took place in the castle's throne room, with Major Harrison presiding over a small gathering of Thomas's fellow guards and senior officers. As he received his new stripes, Thomas felt the weight of increased responsibility settling on his shoulders. The promotion represented not just professional advancement, but also the trust his superiors had placed in his judgment and character. Thomas's new role included mentoring younger guards who joined the Windsor detail. responsibility that brought back memories of how James had welcomed him during his first difficult weeks at the castle. The parallel was not lost on Thomas, who was determined to provide the same support and guidance while instilling the values that would prevent future betrayals. Among the new guards was Sarah Mitchell, a 22-year-old from Wales who had distinguished herself during training and earned assignment to one of the most prestigious posts in the British military. Like Thomas had been 2 years earlier, Sarah was eager, nervous, and overwhelmed by the history and responsibility of serving at Windsor Castle. Thomas took Sarah under his wing much as James had done for him, but with a different perspective. Shaped by recent events, he emphasized not just the technical aspects of their duties, but the moral foundations that made their service meaningful. He spoke about the importance of maintaining integrity even when facing personal difficulties, and the support systems available to guards who found themselves struggling with problems. Outside their professional lives, Sarah proved to be an excellent student, absorbing both the practical knowledge and the ethical principles that Thomas worked to instill. She asked thoughtful questions about the balance between personal relationships and professional duty. Clearly having heard about the James Crawford case through the military's informal communication networks, Thomas answered her questions honestly, using his own experience to illustrate the complexity of moral choices in their line of work. The lessons from James's betrayal had been incorporated into the training programs for all new guards assigned to royal protection duties. Recruits now received extensive briefings on the temptations they might face, the resources available to help them through difficult times, and the catastrophic consequences of betraying their oath. The program also emphasized the importance of reporting suspicious behavior, framing it as protection for colleagues rather than betrayal. Thomas found himself frequently consulted by senior officers who were developing these new training protocols. His first-hand experience with the warning signs of potential betrayal made him valuable in helping others recognize similar situations before they escalated to dangerous levels. The role gave Thomas a sense that James's fall had at least contributed to preventing future incidents. The castle itself seemed to have absorbed the lessons of recent events. New security measures had been implemented without disrupting the delicate balance between protection and accessibility that made Windsor a living palace rather than a fortress. Technology upgrades complemented traditional security methods, creating multiple layers of protection that would make another breach like James's much more difficult to accomplish. Thomas's relationship with the royal family had also evolved during this period. Queen herself had made a point of acknowledging his service during a private ceremony, expressing her personal gratitude for his integrity during the crisis. The brief conversation had been one of the highlights of Thomas's career, representing recognition from the very person he had sworn to protect. The incident had also strengthened bonds among the remaining guards, who had rallied together in the face of external criticism and internal doubt. They had proven that one person's betrayal could not undermine the fundamental integrity of their institution. The shared experience of weathering the crisis had created a deeper sense of mutual trust and commitment. Thomas often thought about James during quiet moments on duty, wondering how his former friend was adjusting to life in prison. He had received one letter from James several months after the sentencing, expressing gratitude for Thomas's testimony and acknowledging that reporting his activities had been the right thing to do. During the letter had provided some closure, though. Thomas still felt sadness about how their friendship had ended. The broader impact of the case had extended throughout the household division and beyond. Other military units responsible for sensitive duties had reviewed their own procedures and support systems, using the lessons learned at Windsor to strengthen their defenses against potential betrayals. The incident had become a case study in military ethics courses, illustrating both the challenges of maintaining integrity under pressure and the importance of placing duty above personal relationships. As Thomas stood guard on a crisp autumn morning, watching the tourists gather for the changing of the guard ceremony, he reflected on how much had changed since his arrival at Windsor. The castle looked the same, with its ancient stones and majestic towers rising against the English sky, but his understanding of his role had deepened considerably. The experience with James had taught Thomas that serving the crown meant more than following orders and maintaining traditions. It required constant vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the human weaknesses that could compromise their mission from within. The responsibility was heavier than he had initially understood, but it was also more meaningful. Sarah approached him as the ceremony preparations began. Her uniform immaculate and her bearing reflecting the pride she took in her duties. "Corporal Whitfield," she said with a smile, "I wanted to thank you again for all the guidance you've provided. I feel ready for whatever challenges might come." Thomas returned her smile, recognizing his own younger enthusiasm in her expression. "Just remember," he said, "the uniform represents centuries of honor and service. Wearing it is a privilege that comes with absolute responsibility to those we protect and to each other." As the band struck up the traditional music for the changing of the guard, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The betrayal that had shaken Windsor Castle had ultimately strengthened their resolve and improved their defenses. James's fall had been tragic, but it had also served as a reminder of the values that made their service worthwhile. The ceremony proceeded with the precision and dignity that tourists expected, but Thomas now understood that the real protection of the royal family happened in the quiet moments between spectacles, in the daily choices made by ordinary people who had accepted an extraordinary responsibility. The secret that had rocked the guard had ultimately reinforced the foundations upon which their service rested, ensuring that Windsor Castle would continue to stand as a symbol of duty, honor, and unshakable loyalty to the crown.